Okay, so we're going to have some time after Professor Hoynes' seminar to answer questions. So if you have questions, please put them into the Q&A. We have lots of time at the end. We will get to your questions. So please don't hesitate to submit questions. Okay, so I am very delighted to have this opportunity to introduce our 2022 Distinguished Lecturer, Professor Hilary Hoynes. I'm a big fan. Professor Hoynes completed her BA in Economics and Math at Colby College in 1983, and after some years of working as a policy analyst in Washington, went on to complete a PhD in Economics at Stanford University under the supervision of Thomas McCurdy, a familiar name to many of us who slogged our way through dynamic labor supply theory in grad school. For the past decade, she's been a professor of economics and public policy at UC Berkeley, where she holds the Haas Distinguished Chair in Economic Disparities and co-directs the Berkeley Opportunity Lab. She's a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the National Academy of Social Insurance, and a fellow of the Society of Labor Economists. She's served as co-editor of the American Economic Review and the AEJ Economic Policy. But none of this, in my view, is what makes Professor Hoynes truly exceptional. Students of the standard curriculum in economic theory can be excused for having the impression that economists believe children don't exist, or at least they don't matter very much. In the standard models we teach, people are born as consumers and workers, and they make continuous choices throughout their lives, in fact, sometimes just once in their life, about how much to work and spend. But this is a gross oversimplification of the research many economists now do, much of it led by a small group of economists, including Professor Hoynes. These researchers put the economic lives of children and the families they grow up in at the front and center of their research questions. Professor Hoynes has been a leader in research focused on child foods insecurity, child poverty, and arguably most important, in my view, government income support programs targeting children in low-income families like the Earned Income Tax Credit in the US and our very closely related Canada Child Benefit. Between 2017 and 2019, she was a member of the National Academy of Sciences Committee on Building an Agenda to Reduce the Number of Children in Poverty by half in 10 years. An initiative echoing Canada's parliamentary pledge in 1989, led by Ed Broadbent to end child poverty by the new millennium. The COVID-19 pandemic has impacted US and Canadian families profoundly. And my expectation is that the coming months and years will illuminate to what extent we've underestimated the impact on our children and just how inequitable those impacts have been. It is within this context that I'm very anxious to hear Professor Hoynes' perspectives today. It's all yours, Professor Hoynes.
Thank you so much for that very kind introduction. I'm delighted to be here today and to spend some time with you talking about the experience in the United States around the COVID crisis, the quite surprisingly robust government response to it, and where we stand today with child poverty. So let me pull up my slides. So I first want to just thank my co-authors, Marion Bittler and Diane Schanzebach. Much of what I'm going to be talking about today comes from the ongoing work that Marion and Diane and I have been doing, where we're trying to sort of do our best to monitor the experience, particularly of disadvantaged families with children and how they're faring in the wake of this tremendous economic crisis that derived from the public health crisis. And I want to kind of arrive at the end of the talk looking a little bit forward about the potential future of the child tax credit in the United States, a really central part of President Biden's agenda around child poverty that I was a little bit more optimistic about a few months ago than I am today. But it's very much modeled on the existing policies in Canada. And I want to sort of talk about where I think we're at in the United States on that and the importance of it as a central feature of a rich country such as the United States. So what I would like to do is start by just sort of reviewing what the labor market crisis looks like in the United States, and then augment that information on the experience of food insecurity, housing insecurity, and other kinds of measures of household distress during the crisis. And then I'll kind of quickly review the main elements that the US pandemic response was to the crisis. And then I kind of want to take a little bit of a walk down a path of my own views about, what was really good about that, what wasn't quite so good about it. And then I want to kind of put it all together to provide an assessment of where poverty rates have moved in the United States in the wake of the pandemic, particularly for children, and then end, as I mentioned, with a discussion of the child tax credit. So zooming way out and just looking at the time series path of monthly unemployment rate for the United States going back to the post-war period, you of course see this, quite dramatic increase in the unemployment rate that really stands out as being unlike anything we've seen before. And this is, very true across many, many countries. What I also want you to see from this is the fact that the unemployment rate has come down quite a lot, almost as quickly as it went up. But if we zero in a little bit more and kind of put different business cycles experienced in the United States since 1980 on the same scale, and the scale being how many months has it been since the last business cycle peak, it provides a little bit more context for, and what I'm plotting here is how much has employment changed. And you can see that by this kind of comparison, once again, the 2020 labor market shock was large and very fast and dramatic and unlike anything you've seen before. But you also kind of get the perspective on the speed at which employment has come back at a much faster pace than we've seen in other economic downturns. Though there's still a long way to go in order to gain back all that employment that was lost in that dramatic period back in March. But this graph really misses what is happening across the population that is kind of in aggregate experiencing these employment changes. So this graph just tries to illustrate the kind of like permanently elevated rates of unemployment that are higher for Black and Hispanic workers in the United States compared to white workers. And essentially those groups also experienced a larger labor market shock and are farther in coming back to their pre-pandemic levels. So the labor market impacts are not equally shared, felt across groups. And even more dramatically than looking at the results by race and ethnicity, as on the prior graph, you see a quite striking concentration of job loss in the sort of people-facing lower wage occupations as reflecting the original shutdown. And this particular graph here is just showing kind of the immediate period, February to July 2020. And in industries such as ours, all of us on this call are privileged enough to be occupying, we were able to move into our homes and continue our work as best we could. And that's not the same experience that was felt by the average low-wage worker in the United States. So with that just very quick kind of backdrop of the crisis itself, what do we know about what is happening to household distress? And I will say that one of the things that I just am so grateful for is that the US Census Department started a new kind of pop-up survey for surveillance purposes during this period. And the Census Department is not known as an agency that, moves quickly. They were kind of in the field doing our decennial census during the pandemic, which, created a lot of challenges. But they ended up adding a household phone survey called the U.S. Household Pulse Survey that has been in the field since, unfortunately, this graph, I realize I didn't put years down, but this starts here. The first point is April 23rd. That's 2020. And about here is where we're in 2021. There's January 2021. And now this goes through data through 2021. And that really has been extremely important for the sort of real-time monitoring of how households are doing. And so this particular graph shows a measure of food insecurity. And in particular, households are asked, over the past 30 days, was it sometimes or often the case that their, quote, food just didn't last, and, quote, they didn't have money to get more? And food insecurity is something that, sadly, really, because of necessity, the United States does monitor on an annual basis. And we have been doing that for maybe 15 years, showing annual statistics on food insecurity. And so this graph shows you over the course of the pandemic, quite elevated rates of food insecurity and just consistently much higher rates for families with children. And we think that the main reason why the higher rates for families with children result is because when the school shut down in March 2020, households not only experienced a loss in earnings because of the job losses that I just showed you on the prior graphs, but 30 million children in the United States get free or reduced price lunches at school, and many of them breakfasts as well. And so if you're a parent of a child who gets those kinds of meals at school, suddenly your earnings have gone down, but so has half of the meals in the week that your child would be getting. Is somehow that just disappears as well, putting an extra strain on those families. And so we see these, quite elevated rates of food insecurity, really peaking near the end of 2020 when the US Congress was sort of in crisis for passing the next bill, to a relief bill, with some kind of secular decline throughout the rest of the period. You also see that these rates of food insecurity are higher among Black and Hispanic households in the United States as compared to white households. So those disparities are sort of pre-existing. And if anything, those inequities across groups tended to grow in the COVID crisis. Finally, from the Census Pulse data, we also have measures where households are asked whether or not they visited a food pantry or received free food in the last week. And you see quite, in the last 7 days. And you see these numbers, for these higher incidence groups of Hispanics and whites hovering around 10% in the last week. So these are quite dramatic measures of economic distress among a large set of households in the United States. A more kind of general measure of economic distress is shown in this graph, again going through 2020 and 2021 from the same Census Household Pulse Survey. So zooming out from just looking at food insecurity, which is kind of repeated here on the gold line, not enough to eat, put on top of that, not caught up on rent or difficulty covering usual expenses, and you see quite high, elevated, persistent rates of economic distress. And many folks have used the Census Pulse data to do real-time evaluations of some of the policies that the Congress and the president have put in place during this 2-year period. And for example, this decline that you see quite dramatically in March 2021 is when the kind of the third and final direct payment was distributed to households after President Biden entered office. So let's talk about what those policies were. And I guess I would just preface this by saying that, as a longtime scholar and observer of the U.S. social safety net, we actually did quite a lot and much more than I would have expected from prior behavior. So what did we do? So there were really 4 different bills that passed Congress and were signed by the president. From March 2020, there were 2 bills passed very quickly, like remarkably quickly for the way things typically move. Another passed in December 2020, and then a final one passed in March 2021. And so instead of going through the bills, that's not very interesting. I want to instead focus on the policies themselves. And so I've sort of organized my description, my very quick description of the policy response into 4 different categories. And the first one is unemployment insurance. So the replacement of lost earnings because of the job loss due to no fault of the workers who were dismissed from work because of the COVID crisis. And so we have an unemployment insurance system in the United States. We've had it for decades. And for most of the 20th century, but it's not very well funded. And one real challenge is each of the 50 states in the United States has the capacity to decide how generous their unemployment insurance system is. And so there's remarkable variation across states in the generosity or lack of generosity of the unemployment insurance system. So one of the real concerns was with that huge loss in jobs that we saw on the first graph, how much of individuals' earnings would be replaced by the unemployment insurance system, and the concern that it wouldn't be enough. So Congress passed a $600 weekly flat top-up of the weekly, which are just typically distributed weekly unemployment payments across the board. Lower income workers and higher income workers. And that was later reduced to $300. And now that has expired. In addition to increasing the amount of the unemployment insurance, the amount of the insurance, there was also a major change that expanded who was eligible, expanding to self-employed and gig economy workers who have never had access. It's always been a traditional employment-based system. And additionally, the traditional unemployment insurance system has requirements that you have to have worked at this job for, 6 quarters and earned a certain amount of income in order to be eligible. And that was eliminated. And so it was quite a broad expansion of eligibility to the program. So that's unemployment insurance. We also had 3 technically called emergency impact payments, but you can think of them as stimulus checks or direct payments. One in March 2020 that was $1,200 per adult, $500 per child. Another one near the end of 2020 that was $600 per person. And then a final one in March 2021 that was $1,400 per person. And additionally, in March 2021, in this big American Rescue Plan that came with Biden entering the presidency, we also expanded a pre-existing child tax credit in the United States, but made it much more generous and extended it to the poorest Americans who, under prior law, were not eligible for the credit. Because the child tax credit prior to March 2021 required you to have earnings over $3,000 per year to start to gain eligibility for the child tax credit. And the March 2021 expansion made it available in a more unconditional sense to workers and non-workers alike at the same value. And both of these kind of direct payments and the child tax credit were quite universal. So not phased out until incomes were more in the $75,000, $100,000, $150,000 a year, depending on whether you're a single filer or whether you're two filers, a married couple filing together. So those were the direct payments. Then we also had expansion of our food and nutrition programs in the United States, which are income targeted at families with incomes below the poverty line or something to that effect. And so we have a pre-existing program called food stamps or SNAP that provides resources on an EBT card that households can use to buy food at the grocery store, essentially almost any food at the grocery store. So it's not cash technically, but in practice, it's very similar to cash because everybody goes to the grocery store and everybody needs spending for food. And so those benefits were raised in a couple of different ways to try to quickly pump more money to households that are low income. So it's a good targeted intervention. And there's very little kind of administrative burden. These households are already on the program. We can just turn up the dial and give folks more benefits during that time. And there were also some sort of lessening of the kind of processes and ways that you have to get on and maintain eligibility that can really keep a lot of people off programs in the United States. There's a lot of paperwork, a lot of in-person meetings, a lot of recertifications, and those were waived because they had closed down the offices. So we also just sort of maintained participation for those households. I had mentioned before that a lot of children in the United States get meals at school, as they do in many countries. We created a new program where they sort of took the cash value of those programs and pushed them out directly to families so that they could use that for their at-home spending. That was a totally new program that they had to build out of nothing in order to get these EBT cards to households. And there was a long delay in that, as you can imagine. So that was like, that's kind of the big picture of sort of what we did. And here is a sense of how big those different kinds of policies were, how much they cost, and what it looked like over time. And this is a pretty dramatic graph. Those direct payments cost a lot. There's a lot of people who have earnings up to $100,000 a year in the United States, and they were very universal. And so what you see is that the green part of the bar are those direct payments, here labeled EIP for economic impact payment. And you can see the first one went out in April, the second one went out in January of 2021, and the third one went out in March to April 2021. And overall, over the entire period, that's about 60% of our spending that we did. The unemployment insurance expansions, the blue, you can see, in the first year was the biggest amount of spending in aggregate. And it's just been quite steady until things started to expire near the latter part of this period. The child tax credit that I mentioned didn't come into play until it was passed in March, and the first monthly payments started showing up in people's bank accounts in July. And so this yellow part of the graph is this new child tax credit payments that came in July. And then finally, the expansions to this income targeted program of food stamps, or SNAP, is very important for that population that gets it, but it's a means tested program. It's not a large amount of the population. And so by comparison, it looks quite small, the orange part of the graph. So what do we think about this, and how do we make a connection between the distress that I showed you earlier and the huge amount of spending that I just said existed? So I want to kind of split this up into sort of the good news and the bad news part of these policy changes. So the good news. This is the same graph I just showed you before, but a cumulative version of it as opposed to month by month. And the bottom line is we spent a lot. And there was a lot of critique in the United States of the insufficient response to the Great Recession and not enough spending at that time. And it was the usual kind of need to have Congress and the president agree on something. And they started out with something around the trillion, and it ended up to be quite a bit less than that. And there's a lot of macroeconomists and others who study, whether it was insufficient. And so just those 4 programs that I walked you through get us spending about 1.4 trillion. There was a lot of other spending. There was spending that went direct to businesses. There's spending that went directly to schools and cities and others. The total spending is something around $3 trillion which is a lot. What also I think is very important to point out is those expansions to unemployment insurance were particularly important, given that, you know, the head of the point of the spear was the loss of work. Having an unemployment insurance system that did a good job of replacing wages has got to be your first line of attack in a economic crisis of job loss. And, you know, the baseline amount of unemployment insurance is very low in many parts of the United States. And so this graph sort of highlights some very low wage occupations, such as food service, janitors, retail, construction, and then some higher wage groups like teachers, nurses, managers, and so on. And the grayish black part of the bar tells you on average across the United States what would be the replacement rate. So how much of your earnings would be replaced by unemployment insurance if you lost your job. And you can see that the replacement rate, it's a little bit of a progressive program, so higher replacement rates for lower wage workers. But even the lowest wage workers, the replacement rate is only about 50%. And when you think about the nature of the COVID crisis and the expected time out of the labor market and the no fault of your own not being able to work, that feels pretty problematic that the replacement rate was only 50%. And of course, much lower as you move up the earnings distribution. So this $600, you know, as an interesting side note, the main reason why this was a flat $600 rather than just saying, hey, why don't we just increase the replacement rate to 90% or something like that? The main reason is, and this gets to something that I want to talk about at the end in terms of like where we need to do better, is that these are state administered programs. So, you know, you're like replicating the wheel 50 times to administer a program. And a lot of states, like even my own, which is a well-functioning, big, rich state, has a infrastructure for running our unemployment insurance system. It's like 50 years old. They've got to bring in retired COBOL programmers. Okay, how many people on this call knows what COBOL is? Those of us that are old enough do. And they bring these guys out of retirement in order to, when they need to make changes to their code. That's how old it is. And so it was viewed that it just wasn't going to be possible to do a more kind of smarter version of an expansion of unemployment insurance, but they thought they could just top it up and they could get that out in the field pretty quickly. So it's quite interesting why that choice was made. But at the end of the day, you can see that there was a lot of hand-wringing and debate about whether this was, quote, too generous because it was paying many low-wage workers above the wages that they'd ever earned before because they get paid so little. So we can come back to that and maybe talk about these issues around concerns, concerns around work disincentives and what role that may or may not have played in the recovery in the United States. Perhaps we could talk about that in the Q&A. So this graph, just to put it in a little bit of perspective, you know, I talked about this low 50% replacement rate for low-wage workers. That's national. There's a lot of variation across states. So the darker the shaded area, the lower the replacement rate that the unemployment insurance system delivers in those states. And you can see a quite large amount of variation. Part of this variation might just be differences in the nature of the employment pool across these states and who is unemployed, but most of it is due to differences in the generosity across states. And so, you know, one of the things a lot of people are talking about in the United States right now is whether we should have a state administered system and whether it should be federalized in order to create a true and more certain safety net. So another part of the good response is I mentioned before how, you know, this food stamp program is targeted at a low income population. It's a program that's already in place. It's federally administered, so it's a pretty well, you know, maintained across states. And it was easy to just, like I said, turn up the dial and get higher benefits to those households that were already receiving. And you can see that the amount of food stamp spending that went to households increased by, you know, up to more than doubled during this time period. Much of it in the first year, and then more as expanded, further expansions took place. We didn't see that many more folks end up on food stamps. It was more about increasing the benefits of who was already on the program. So those are like two dimensions of things that I think were very important, and were certainly critical in the response to COVID. One thing you might be asking yourself is, wait a second, didn't Hilary show me earlier that we have these very high rates of food insecurity? And then you show me later that even with those high rates of food insecurity, we spend over $1 trillion. Like, how can that be? Like, what would the counterfactual be? How much worse would those outcomes be if we hadn't spent that $1 trillion or more? So that's where we kind of get from the good to the bad. And so there's a couple of things to point out that are important for recognizing the limitations of the current system and where we need to do more. The first one is our safety net excludes certain groups. Not everybody is getting these benefits. First of all, almost all of those things I told you about before, the direct impact payments, the child tax credit, the unemployment insurance, and much of the food and nutrition programs, unauthorized workers, undocumented workers in the United States, recent immigrants are not eligible for those benefits. So that is a large number of millions of households in the United States that are categorically not able to receive these benefits. A couple of states, notably California and New York, passed some smaller direct payment programs specifically targeted on this group that was excluded, but they were small compared to the federal response. That's point one. Point two is that despite the expansions I talked about in unemployment insurance, it still doesn't cover everybody. Specifically with respect to those direct impact payments that are very important, there's a way in which legal immigrants in the United States can get a what's called an ITIN number that's instead of a Social Security number that they use to pay taxes and do the things that we're supposed to do on the way to getting a green card and getting a citizenship. The first wave of these direct payments excluded all households where there was anyone who was an ITIN filer in it. So for example, you could have an immigrant parent with citizen children because the citizen children were born in the United States, and the whole family was excluded from these direct payments. So this is a little bit getting in the weeds, but the point is that we can have these policies written down, but if there are groups that are left out, they're going to be ineffective at providing the insurance that we needed to have for the population at large. The second observation in the not so good category is new programs take time to roll out. And a lot of those measures of economic distress were particularly in the first months when things were not happening very quickly. So the expansions in unemployment, particularly this new program that expanded to the self-employed and other groups, the states had to kind of invent those processes and get them going. The program to provide the school meals on a debit card to households had to be set up. And many states took a very long time for these things to come into place. So this is a graph from some work that Marion Bittler and Diane Schanzenbach and I did, where we got information at, when did the states start these PEBT programs, like actually getting to households. And you can see the bill was originally passed back in March of 2020. And by June of 2020, that's 3 months later, only about 50% of children lived in states where they had figured out how to get these programs out. And we had to wait till, much later in the summer in order to have most children getting those benefits. And that's a long time to wait for, thinking it from your own household budgeting, having to, provide, you have 2 children, that's 10 meals a week if they're getting breakfast and lunch that you weren't having to pay for before. So lastly, because it deserves to be in a category that's worse than bad, so what's very bad is that, again, we had a lot of system failures, overloaded unemployment insurance system, directly related to underinvestment, kind of like the story I told about old programming in a state that's generally well functioning in California, but also states that seem to be putting in a lot of roadblocks to make their benefits hard to access. Um, and so, states were burdened with a huge increase in demand, and many states were simply not ready for the job. After the Great Recession in 2008, 2009, 2010, a lot of states disinvested in their unemployment insurance system in terms of the number of workers in their state agency and the generosity of their program. Um, they built in a lot of complicated application requirements that seems to, on average, kind of shut out access to the most disadvantaged families. And these are kind of perpetual problems that we see in the United States, particularly for programs that are administered at the state level. And this unemployment insurance was a particularly challenging delay that many states experienced. The new policy to expand unemployment was passed in March. And here's an example of just some states where Kansas, for example, didn't get their first unemployment insurance checks, their first out to this new population until 2 months later in May, which is quite difficult, as one could imagine, if you don't have a lot of savings built up to protect you. Just to give you some idea of just how challenging this is for the states, California in particular has quite good, there's very good access to their unemployment insurance data. And the team, my colleagues at the California Policy Lab, did amazing work kind of doing real-time surveillance of how our state unemployment insurance system was doing. And just to kind of give you a sense of just how difficult this was for many states, this is just California, what this graph shows you here is how many unique unemployment insurance claimants were there relative to the size of the labor force pre-crisis. And so statewide, that number was 48%. So almost half of the labor force in the state ended up getting unemployment insurance. It's mind-boggling that that's even possible. And you can see that the lighter blue part of the graph, the 18.2%, is this new program that covered self-employed workers and people with less work experience. And that's the bit that took a really long time to get out in the field and get into people's bank accounts. And you can also get a sense of just how much higher these rates of claiming are for younger workers compared to middle-aged workers, different generations, and more for women than for men. Another very important thing that just needs to be called out about the reality of the United States system is it appears to me, looking at the data, that there's a lot of inequities that are baked into the system. That is, they seem to look as though they're somewhat by design. So again, going to this California data, which provides quite rich data on location of individuals and so on, the team at the California Policy Lab took all of these information on claiming rates for unemployment insurance across the state and correlated higher claiming rates, which I'm interpreting here is you were eligible for unemployment and you were able to successfully get it. And what you can see is, and it correlates that with different characteristics of counties and neighborhoods where people live, and they're ordered by that correlation. And what you can see is that the areas of California that were richer, whiter, with higher rates of access to high-speed internet, had higher rates of gaining access to unemployment insurance. Whereas the lowest, the level of largest kind of negative correlation is the highest rate of percent of individuals in poverty saw the lowest conversion to gaining unemployment insurance. So to me, this is a real indictment of the difference between what a policy on paper looks to be ensuring versus de facto who ends up receiving the benefits for a lot of complicated reasons that I can't track or explain. But these differences by group we see time and time again in others in the United States. So this is an example from a recent paper by Hilary Hoynes and Brian Stewart that uses data just prior to COVID and shows and does a very careful job of taking each data point and trying to figure out if this unemployed worker actually is eligible for unemployment or not. And so on the right, that's where we see the rates of take-up of unemployment conditional on being eligible. And we see consistently higher take-up rates among white compared to Black workers. Part of this is, as Kuka and Stewart explore in their paper, part of this is explained by where different groups live and states that just uniformly do a bad job of getting folks on unemployment, because maybe there's an hour a day you can call the helpline and you can never get through to someone. And when you've got an error, there's nobody to talk to. And, you know, I was helping my own 25-year-old daughter try to gain access to unemployment when she lost her job back in March of 2020. And it was a mess and difficult. And we managed to eventually do it. And so there's a lot of, a lot of sausage making that happens in the process of gaining eligibility. And I would go to, I look forward to reading some deep ethnographies of this time to learn more about who got access, who didn't, and why. And I can't really give you too much insight into that right now. But we think that there's a pattern of administrative burdens, that is just hassles that make it hard to gain access to programs, that are experienced differently across groups, that are partly due to access to the internet, the time, and the many other things that folks are juggling. So that's a problem. A final thing that I want to talk about has to do with, again, baked into the system, that's kind of the theme of this part of my remarks, is that we do a lot of pandemic aid and redistribution in general through the tax system in the United States. And so those direct payments back starting in March of 2020 were all sort of initiated through the tax system. And the same thing for the child tax credit. So what happened is, for very good reason and with the best of intent, I think, Treasury wanted to come up with a plan that could get the money out as soon as possible. And so after the bill was passed in March of 2020, they basically set up a database with any person who had filed taxes in either of the last two tax years, 2018 or 2019, because 2020 forms weren't filed for everybody by that time. They took that as a starting point of a database and augmented it with information on Social Security recipients who earn sufficiently little that many of them don't have to file taxes. And that was the database that automatically received these stimulus payments without having to take any action at all. In fact, if the Treasury had your banking details because you had made payments or they had given you a refund by your bank, it would just drop in your bank account with a direct deposit. If they didn't have that, they cut checks. That took a little longer and they sent those out. That's great for those that are in the system. But the population we might be the most concerned about, those with the lowest incomes, the most vulnerable, without a lot of savings, that population are not very connected to the tax system because they don't earn enough to be required to file taxes. And there was an estimated 12 million individuals who were eligible for these payments, but would not get them unless they affirmatively took action to apply for them through this new IRS portal that they built for this purpose. So all those things were done, and that's great. but it's a consequence of building a system on the tax system that is not compulsory, that everybody is in, that systematically leaves certain groups out. And we still at this date don't have the data to really know how many folks ended up receiving those payments that they were eligible for, and how many folks kind of gave up because it was complicated or something else. We do have one data point, the most recent data that I know of, from the Urban Institute Coronavirus Tracking Survey, that showed that as of the end of May, about 60% of those in families below poverty had received one of these stimulus payments, compared to 78% of those who were eligible and had income above poverty. So that's a pretty big disparity. That's troubling. So let me just sort of wrap up, or start to wrap up, by kind of trying to put this all together. So, like most countries, we monitor poverty rates in the United States. We do so on an annual basis, and most countries do. That's a little bit problematic if you want to be tracking how people are doing during a pandemic, given the amount of time one has to wait to get annual poverty rates for 2020, say. In the United States, those numbers came out in September 2021, a year and a half into the crisis. Many researchers started measuring poverty monthly using the best data they had available to them to try to help with surveillance, which was great. And so the dark line here, the lighter blue line, is the poverty rate, the monthly poverty rate that folks have been measuring, that is inclusive of these policies that I just talked about. And you can see that it sort of changes over time. It goes down when some of these new payments sort of show up, and increases. And so we've got some evidence on monthly poverty rates. But once we had those 2020 poverty rates that I just mentioned came out in 2021, we saw a quite remarkable thing. And that is that in the United States, our annual statistics show that 2020 had lower poverty rates than 2019. And I show you them here. The part in orange is the amount by which the poverty rate declined between 2019 and 2020 for all persons on the left, for children on the right, and by group. This is not what I expected in March of 2020. But I think what it shows is that it's not rocket science how to reduce child poverty. You got to spend money to do it, and you need to target it, and you need to make sure that the right folks get it. And it's not anything that I would have expected would have happened. And I should say that this is in 2020, before this new child tax credit, which didn't come up until 2021. And so if you unpack that and say, well, what was causing, practically speaking, these reductions in poverty? Which programs were doing what? If you unpack that, and this is just for children, child poverty overall, you can see that the largest reduction in child poverty was through that not very targeted economic impact payment, because it adds up to a lot of money. The second largest was the earned income tax credit, and that's like policy held constant. That's just kind of always doing a lot to reduce child poverty in the United States. It's the in-work tax credit for low-income families. Unemployment insurance, never seen that show up as being quantitatively important for poverty reduction, but with those large top-ups, it did a lot. It's a 2 percentage point drop in child poverty due to the unemployment insurance system, and you can sort of see the rest and how they show up across these groups. And so, with that, I want to just kind of end by talking about the child tax credit and its potential for, again, it's not rocket science, how you reduce child poverty. So let me just step back, and perhaps I should have shown this as the very first. I was thinking today as I was preparing getting ready for this talk, and thought maybe this should be the first graph, but hopefully you're still on this call and you're still excited. This is a scatter plot from OECD data, where the x-axis is what percent of a country's GDP do they spend on, quote, family benefits, policies for children. And the y-axis is, in an attempt to measure this the same way across countries, what is the child poverty rate in those countries? And we can see Canada here, sort of in the middle of the pack in spending, and then kind of in the middle of the pack on child poverty. There are places like particularly in Scandinavia, where you see much higher rates of spending and much lower rates of child poverty. And the United States has it's not good. It's the bad. We're in the bad part of the graph, which is very low spending on family benefits and very high rates of child poverty. And I don't have this in my slides, but if I were to show you the same pattern for spending on the elderly, we look like a kind of medium country. We're kind of in the middle of the pack. And so we don't spend low amounts on everybody. It's the children in particular that are underinvested in the United States relative to other countries. And there are consequences of that. So, why, in what ways do we spend less? Well, we have programs that aren't universal. We don't give much out in cash. We make a lot of conditionality, like you have to be working in order to get the benefits, which sort of leaves the most, the most low income without much in the way of protection. And our funding levels aren't very high. So it's kind of that simple. The child tax credit that came out in 2021 was really meant to be part of Biden's big social policy bill that was going to last beyond the pandemic crisis. And so we implemented, for 1 year only, a child tax credit that was modeled in many ways off of the Canadian system, not funded at as high a level, but with a similar kind of structure. So if you had a child under age 6, you would get $3,600 per year distributed monthly. And you would get that if you had no earnings, you would get that if or no income. And it had a very flat profile up until very high income. So typically in the United States, we're very fond of programs that might provide some benefits if you don't have any earnings, but then they're phased out very dramatically and very concentrated on the poorest. This policy was meant to do something much more universal and not really phase it out until quite, upper middle income levels. And so that's what was created in this American Rescue Plan in 2021. And just for reference, we do have a pre-existing child tax credit, and it goes out, if you're a married couple, this pre-existing child tax credit, you gain until your income goes up to about $400,000 a year. So it's quite universal on the upper tail of the distribution, but its structure at the bottom, because of this kind of compulsion to have these work requirements, doesn't provide the benefit to the lowest income families. So this child tax credit has been, if everybody got it, would maybe lead to as much of a 40% reduction in child poverty. It suffers from those same problems as I mentioned with the direct impact payments, because the benefits were being pushed out through the universe of tax filers. And so there's been a lot of work to try to get families into the system to get these benefits. But by any measure, it would be, if it were permanent, the biggest one thing that the United States ever did for child poverty. We've never really had a universal benefit. We're behind most rich countries in that regard. And, it was mentioned in the introduction that I was on this National Academy of Sciences panel a few years ago, where our mandate was to propose policies that had an evidence base. We couldn't just we had to have some, justification for why these would work and what they would do. But our mandate was to propose policies that would reduce child poverty and deep poverty, which is having income below 50% of the poverty line within 10 years. And really a central element of those policy recommendations that we made was a child allowance. And it was very influenced by the success of the Canadian Child Benefit. And, one of the things that I've been working on quite a lot lately is to try to help build the evidence around what it means to provide more assistance when children are young and what that means for a child's life trajectory. So there's this growing amount of evidence that shows that, if families have access to more resources maybe particularly when their children are young, that not only leads to lower food insecurity today, as we've seen, or lower rates of poverty, but what we know from recent work and longitudinal data and a bit of time and waiting for these results to emerge is that we see that children end up with higher education levels, higher earnings in adulthood, lower rates of being in poverty. They live in better neighborhoods, are more likely to be homeowners, end up being more likely to live longer and less likely to be incarcerated. And if you quantify all these things, you can make a quite compelling case that we should be thinking about the social safety net for children as an investment in those children and therefore, by extension, in society as a whole. And that, is kind of I think what recent research allows us to say something about that adds to the sort of justification for why these programs are so essential. Unfortunately, because of, and this is really getting in the weeds of US politics, because of one senator from the great state of West Virginia, our child tax credit is now in limbo. It was kind of a central feature of the president's post-pandemic social policy bill that also included a kind of universal pre-K program, family leave, a lot of things that other countries are already funding. And right now that is, we don't know what's going to happen. But the path to that passing seems to be very much in doubt at this point. So the child tax credit, we only have that expanded child tax credit, we only have for 1 year. So let me just conclude by saying, and then I'm just delighted to take your questions, that I think overall, the US response was quite excellent, much better than I would have imagined from prior experience. There was a combination of programs used. Many of them provided direct payments to households. It was a quite robust response and more equitable maybe than prior recession responses have been. Importantly, as I hope that is clear to all of you, I think it shows very clearly that persistent, high poverty rates is a choice. It is a policy choice for a country to make. A little bit more in the weeds, we need to reckon with how to make our system work better and to be more prepared for the next crisis. And one of the things that's at the top of the list of most labor economists that I talk to, or public economists, is the importance of federalizing key programs like unemployment insurance. Why is Social Security national, but unemployment insurance allowed to vary by state? If we consider this to be a fundamental part of our social insurance system, why do we allow states to defund them and make them so much less protective in some states than others? I think we might want to think about just whether we should have a little bit more targeting in some of those direct payments. You saw how big those spending, how much of what we spent on the direct payments, and a lot of them went to households that, possibly didn't need them. Could we repurpose that and be a little bit more equitable in our response? And I think generally, what this has shown us is the real absence of out-of-work benefits in the United States in a general degree, and the importance of, building a social safety net that conditions on work doesn't do a very good job when there isn't work. And so I will end there, and I look forward to having a conversation.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Professor Hoynes. That was, I learned a lot from that. I've been following the Canadian case and just juxtaposing the different policy responses is fascinating. And knowing how Europe dealt with this is also really interesting. Maybe I'll just start right away by being selfish here and trying to pick your brain on something that I've been thinking about, and it's related to some research I've started. So the really big policy question initially in March 2020 was whether or not to provide, as you said, the first response should be a income support program like UI. But of course, in Europe, the first response was much more about trying to provide wage subsidies and keep employer-employee relationships intact. And Canada really shuffled in the first week. I mean, there was a tremendous amount of waffling about which way to go on this. And what ended up happening was realized quickly the UI system, as you said, because of the COBOL programmers weren't going to be able to pull this thing off. They put it through our treasury, our tax agency. We created an emergency program with $500 a week payments, the universal, and sort of anybody who'd been affected by this, and there was no, everybody just sort of claimed themselves whether they were eligible. Anyway, so that turned out to be a very large program. And so the wage subsidy program did come later, but it's not clear what the effect of that is. So what I'm going to ask you about is something that you didn't mention in your talk, but I'm sure you've thought about is where does the payroll protection program, the PPP, fit into all of this? And what would have been the workers that perhaps, was it effective? And if it was, where in the income distribution were these workers that may have had their jobs saved as a result of that program?
Yeah, thank you for that question. And I know a little bit more to answer it because a new paper came out this week that kind of looks at the PPP. So for those who don't know what that means, there was this payroll protection program, which was, in addition to the unemployment insurance, was monies that were sent directly to firms. They had to apply for them. So firms would apply for a PPP loan that they were told, and every indication is that this is in fact true, that the loan would be forgiven as long as they could show evidence that they didn't lay people off. So the idea was, and I'm actually on a couple of nonprofit boards, and I remember we had a board meeting about, should we apply for this, and et cetera, et cetera. But, very, very large firms applied for this, and it's also small firms. I have a friend who has a small construction business here in Berkeley, and he applied for it. So, but you had to do it. You had to apply for these benefits, and it was, there's a limited pot of money, and so you had to be organized and get in it. And then ultimately, I don't know that much about how firms did the documentation to show that indeed they didn't lay people off in order to have the loan forgiven. I don't know very much about that. But, there was just a study that came out just this week by David Otter and a large number of co-authors. And it basically kind of takes the data that Treasury has on which firms actually got these payments, and they analyzed sort of the distribution of where the payments went, and also where in the income distribution the payments kind of indirectly landed. And the answer is it was an extremely untargeted program, that the vast majority of benefits went to firms that were sort of in a much higher income quartile. And in this moment, I don't actually know whether it was about the characteristics of the workers or more characteristics of the firm. But for those that are interested, I recommend diving into that paper. It's not really a wage replacement program in the kind of typical sense, which is these firms were not mechanically passing this on to the workers, because after all, any workers who lost their jobs would be getting unemployment insurance. The way, the argument that's pro wage subsidy as opposed to unemployment insurance is the desire to maintain the connection between the employer and the employee. So the way a typical wage subsidy program would work is that the federal government would pay the firm to pay the workers, say a 90% replacement rate or an 80% replacement rate or something like that. And the worker would maintain the connection to the firm. They wouldn't technically be unemployed. They'd be employed, but their pay is being paid for in a pass-through down from the federal government. So that's the kind of standard wage subsidy program. I think the thing about the PPP is that there's no way to really track where that went and how much of it actually went to workers versus the many other things that could be spent on. And I think, although I haven't dived into it, that this Otter et al. Paper gives us a little bit of insight into that. So I do think I think in the very early part of the crisis, everybody, a lot of people, I was on several calls. There was this like unemployment insurance pop-up kind of working group that met by Zoom, once a month for the first 6 months of the crisis. And there were a lot of people advocating that, this is going to be a good example of how our UI system is not the right choice because, the nature of this crisis was so severe and it's not, we'd be really worried about 50 million workers dislocating from firms and the effort that it takes for that reconnection, right? But quite amazingly, like this work in California where they're following workers in the unemployment insurance system, it seems like a lot of workers did rematch with their original firm. So I think we still have a lot to learn, and I'm sure we will over time learn a lot more in retrospect about the success of these very different ways of trying to do the same thing, protect workers in times of job loss.
Yeah. Thank you. So if you have a question, please put it up on the Q&A. We don't have a lot of questions so far, so there's a good chance your question is going to get asked if you put it up there. But I did see some hands on the panel. Amit, did I see your hand? I'm not seeing any hands now. Or Francisco, I see a hand there. Francisco, do you want to ask a question?
Yes, thank you. Thanks, Hilary. This was such an interesting talk. So I want to follow up from your concluding remark. I wonder if you have any thoughts about what the main characteristics of a social safety net that doesn't work through employment or taxes would be.
Yeah. So here's one thing that I think it makes sense. You can think about the tax filers as being a handy database to build out who then you're going to send something to. So whether or not Treasury is the one that sends the payment or the check, I think that I don't have an opinion on that. But what I do have an opinion about is how we build the data in order to be as far-reaching as possible in transmitting these payments to the eligible individuals. So let me be specific, one specific example. So I mentioned that the original stimulus payments started with, if you're a tax filer in 2018 or 2019, that was the first decision. And then there was a lot of consternation about leaving out the elderly, and many of the elderly who are just living on Social Security don't pay taxes. And so it was decided, it's like, wait a second, we have that information on these individuals. It's a federal program. Let's bring that data over and augment the tax data to include the elderly. And it was also done for veterans payments. But there was one thing that could be done. It would make it so much more inclusive. And that is these food stamp benefits, which is a federal program, but technically is administered by the states. And so the federal, the agency, the U.S. Department of Agriculture that runs this program does not have the microdata for all of the food stamp recipients in the United States. So it's this like disaggregated data system that made it very difficult to include them. I think if we had that data, then we would get very far, because most poor Americans that don't file taxes are receiving some other kind of benefit that the federal government has a hand in, either food stamps or medical benefits. And those policies tend to know the things you need to know for these program administration, like what your income is and how many people in your family there are. It's kind of that simple. But one other kind of service thing that I've been involved in the United States is to try to promote better administrative data for research and, tracking and evidence. And this is a very good example. If we had already made progress on that, I think we could have augmented that tax return data with information on folks that are outside the tax system. So I'm not against the idea of using the tax data or even having the Treasury be the one who is administering it. But I think what we need to do is to build a better data system in order to have closer to the universe of Americans as the starting point.
Right.
So,
Thank you.
Okay, any more questions from the panel? Anna?
Thank you, Hilary. That was so interesting. I have a question, wondering if maybe you can elaborate. So it's obvious that technology is playing a part in, who gets in and who gets out, but maybe you have some more insight into the digital divide, because it's not just being in the database. No, as you mentioned, many people may just give up because it's too difficult to get through. They don't have, a speedy internet, or they have to go to a library or a place that is close and they cannot. So is there any other insight that, can help with this?
I think that I can't be specific about this because I don't, there's not studies that allow us to really unpack why it is that we see some groups that are better at gaining access to programs that they're eligible for than other groups. But I think some indirect evidence suggests that there's a couple of different reasons why. And I think one does have to do with more of the digital divide and access around that. For example, a lot of these websites weren't designed for mobile. And honestly, most people that, I'm on my computer all the time, but most people are not. And most people gain access to everything that they need, out in the world through their phone. And so many of these applications weren't really designed very well for use in a mobile setting. And then imagine that you need to then find some bills and things to upload. I don't even honestly know how I would do that on my phone. I suppose there are some things I could take a picture of, but then I'd have to have the piece of paper. My daughter just came over the other day because she needed to print something out because she couldn't go to the library to do it or whatever. And no one has printers anymore. And I, of course, do. Probably all of us on this call are printing stuff off all the time. It's so mundane to say it, but when you actually experience the act of trying to access something with the tools and availability that you have, you can see how it could get quite complicated. And then it seems as though layering on top of that, we're, particularly with respect to unemployment insurance, everything, there was such a high rate of applications being rejected. And so then what do you got to do? You've got to call up to get someone on the phone to help you figure out how to solve the problem. And that was a huge amount of a holdup, mostly because, demand was really high and there weren't enough people on the phone in order to do that customer service. And then it's about persistence and calling and calling and calling and having the bandwidth to do that, having the time to do that. So I think I think there's a lot of work going on. There's a lot of interest right now in the United States anyways, in trying to really learn more about how to make programs work better. In fact, the president actually had an executive order that was signed a couple of weeks ago that's literally about improving the customer experience in the United States. I don't know how much teeth there is in it. I haven't dug into it. But there's a lot of very interesting research going on right now, trying to understand how we can help improve access. And so there was a very interesting RCT that Amy Finkelstein and Matt Notowidgo did that was trying to get elders more access to food stamps. And they basically had two different treatment arms. And these were among a population that was eligible for a program, but they weren't getting it. One treatment arm was like a standard information treatment. Here's a letter. You might be eligible for this thing. Here's the office near you where you can find out and gain eligibility. The other treatment arm was all of that plus here's a concierge phone number where we've got someone on the line to help walk you through the service. And what they found was that concierge line, both treatment arms increased participation, but adding on the concierge line more than doubled the amount of folks that ended up converting onto this program. And it also showed that the most vulnerable, which in their data they were able to measure by like how sick the individuals were, because this was data coming from public health insurance and age, that they found that this concierge line actually really helped convert folks who looked like they were the most vulnerable. So you turn that upside down and say programs that don't have that, which is the status quo, tend to more commonly keep out folks who we might think are the most, that we think need the protection. And so there's quite a lot of research going on by a lot of different folks right now with different RCTs, different interventions to try to understand what, practically speaking, are the roadblocks and what kinds of changes can we make that seem to help improve them. And I think it's extremely exciting. I'm running a conference in a couple of weeks with colleagues at the Russell Sage Foundation, and it's all about learning about administrative burdens, which is kind of the catch-all title for this. And we originally were going to have a one-day conference, and we had so many good submissions that we convinced the Russell Sage Foundation to fund a two-day conference because there was so much work going on in this area, from public housing to education to democracy and voting and immigration and pretty much any aspect of kind of public life. So I'm very excited about that. But I do think it's an area where we have a lot to learn. Like, let me give one example: unemployment insurance. It seems to me when you lose your job, we could probably set up a system where you're automatically notified that you're eligible. We've got all the information we need. We have your work history. Why can't we just set up a system where I get a notification that says, I see that you've been separated from your worker, from your firm. Given your work history, you should be eligible for this amount, call this number and we'll make it happen. Like, that is possible. And we could also say, and given your earnings level, it looks to us like you might be eligible for food stamps. Here's a number you can call to find out about that. We need to do more defaulting in. We need to build the data systems to make that possible. So I don't know. I think we have a lot to learn.
Thank you. That was very telling, actually.
So the questions are pouring in now. So I'm going to throw two really big questions here. This is totally unfair, but I'm going to do it. Given the huge amount of spending, $3 trillion in spending, there are two impacts here that people are thinking about: inflation and work incentives. But on the inflation front in particular, can you say something about how inflation may affect disadvantaged families differently, and how we measure inflation may not capture the distributional effects of these price changes adequately?
Really great question. Our national statistics, like most countries, are just in aggregate. You've got a set basket of goods, and maybe at best you're going to get information on inflation rate for different increases in prices for different kinds of goods. So you could sort of look, we know gasoline is going to be more impacted by lower income families, and food will be more impacted by lower income families, and so on. But our system is really not built for a distributional analysis. Our system has traditionally been built for an aggregate, classic macroeconomic kind of statistic. And this is something that people have been talking about. And it is something where I think there's some really good work being done that kind of just shows mechanically that inflation is felt differently across different parts of the population. And generally speaking, most of the sources of the kind of core kind of inflation that we're seeing now are experienced to a greater degree by folks that have lower amounts of income. And so that's just, I think that's an important like finding, and something that, I think we need to do better at. And I know it's outside my area, but I know people are talking about how to devise national statistics that are in general more distributional. And this would be a central one. So I appreciate that question. It has certainly been something that there's been a lot of debate about. Larry Summers very, very publicly came out when these policies were first being proposed. I see a lot of people nodding. We all kind of remember that, where he came out and said, this is a big problem. We're spending too much. This is going to be inflationary, and it's going to lead to debt, and it shouldn't, we're doing too much. And now we have inflation. It seems to me, by both comparing across countries, what other countries are also experiencing inflation, number one, and number two, when you unpack it, you really see that inflation really is increasing in a lot of areas where we have demand surging. And possibly coupled with supply chain interruptions. So, I'm certainly not an expert on this, but from what I read, I feel fairly convinced that this is more about the pandemic and less about the $3 trillion. On the work incentives, we've already got some research out on this. And I think, there's no denying that let's just say it's a theorem in labor economics, that the higher the replacement rate in unemployment insurance, the slower workers are going to get back to work. That is that makes all the sense in the world, and has absolutely been backed up by prior research. The question is, how big is that elasticity? How much does the transition to work change in a practical sense, in a real empirical data research sense, when the replacement rate goes up? And so there's been there's a lot of experiments that we've been able to engage in just during this period, because we had the $600, it disappeared overnight. There was a period where nothing happened until Congress came back and then added a $300. That was there for a while. It disappeared overnight. And then on top of that, a bunch of states said, federal government, we don't want your money because we want our population to get back to work. So we're going to give you this money back, and we're going to take the $300 away before you take it away from us. And so there was even variation across states in when those $300 payments disappeared. And so people have mined that data and examined it and found small, very small changes, sometimes not statistically detectable, in the transitions back to work when those payments disappeared. And so, how much is that generalizable to a setting that isn't the very unusual one that we've lived through? I don't know. Probably not completely generalizable. But I think the bottom line is there's a lot of evidence that that is not what's holding back the labor market. And in fact, all of that is gone now anyways. But, those are two things that are probably the most hotly debated issues in the policy space. Well, now it's really all inflation because, people are kind of forgetting about the work incentives. But sort of thinking back over this 2 years, the questioners have raised some points that are very, very salient.
It's fascinating. We're gonna be studying this COVID epidemic or pandemic for many, many years. There's much to learn, and I think the international comparisons, I'm hopeful we're going to learn a lot from those, because countries took different approaches. In Canada, if you look at core age labor force participation, Canada, we're above where we were before the pandemic. We're still more than fully recovered, whereas the U.S., there's clearly been some kind of looks like much more persistent denting of labor force participation. So it'll be really interesting to learn what's happened. Okay, so we have run out of time. I want to thank you very much for agreeing to do this, Professor Hoynes. This has been a real pleasure. And now I'm going to pass it over to our Dean, Sheila Ager, to bring this to a conclusion. You're on mute, Sheila, I think.
course I am. It's the song of the pandemic. So thanks so much, Mikhail, and many thanks to you, Dr. Hoynes, for such a stimulating lecture. Now, I want to start off by saying I always find it in poor taste when someone in my position who's been asked to thank the speaker does so by talking about themselves. Nevertheless, I'm going to do it just for a minute. I did my undergraduate degree at Queen's University, where, at least in my day, there were no breadth requirements to force narrow-minded students such as myself to leave their comfort zone. And at the time, I was so focused on the humanities and the natural sciences that I never took a single social science course. So there is my shameful confession that I am making to my colleagues in economics, not to mention psychology, sociology, and political science. But genuinely, for a long time now, I have considered this to be a very serious, even if self-imposed, gap in my education. So I'm particularly delighted to have been able to participate in an event such as this with a distinguished speaker who's put before us such timely and significant food for thought. I found especially thought-provoking, I think, what Mikhail just referred to, the contrast Dr. Hoynes has demonstrated between Canadian and American responses to the pandemic, let alone responses around the world. And even with all the issues that Dr. Hoynes has identified, the US did provide the universal support payments and additional universal support payments and adjusted unemployment insurance programs to better respond to the economic consequences of the pandemic. And I find this very interesting because we do have a frequent tendency in Canada to pat ourselves on the back and to congratulate ourselves on a social safety net that we fondly imagine to be better always than its stereotypical American counterpart. And I think it's really good for us to have a healthy check put on our assumptions now and then, and to be made aware that things are not always as simple as we think in either country. So I want to thank you, Dr. Hoynes, most enthusiastically for being with us today. The expertise that Dr. Hoynes has demonstrated in this talk in issues around poverty and social disparity and economic crisis, and in particular, the impact of all of these on children, is clearly matched by the genuine care and compassion that I see she brings to this work. I think, which was also evidenced by the role she's played on the National Academy of Science Committee on Reduction of Child Poverty, as Professor Scooterud mentioned in his introduction. I'm sure that all the economists here are sick to death of people quoting Thomas Carlyle on economics being the dismal science, which is about as sick as I am as an ancient historian of hearing the phrase, "It's all Greek to me." I think a presentation such as the one Dr. Hoynes has given us reminds us that far from being a dismal science, the core concepts and values of economics are deeply humane. It's not only an understanding of some of the most basic structures and functioning of human society, but also a dedication and commitment to leveraging that understanding for the betterment of human life. For example, I love the comment that you just made in the Q&A about defaulting into social and financial supports rather than the defaulting out that we so often see. So I want to thank you again, Dr. Hoynes, not only for sharing with us today the results of your research and your experience, but also for inspiring us with your example as an intellectual who brings her learning to bear on making real change. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Hager. So I don't know, Margaret, did you want to say something just to end us off here, or?
I don't think so. I would just say
Okay.
to everybody who's attended, and thank you to all those who were able to come, and to Hilary and Dr. Hoynes in particular.
Okay. Thank you, everybody. Everyone have a great weekend, and we'll see you soon, hopefully.